Before 1900, before diesel tugs, hydraulic cranes, and depth sonar, the Royal Navy's fleet needed a harbour deep enough to hold it and calm enough to keep it safe, and the only bay that fit was open to the worst weather in the English Channel. Plymouth Sound faces southwest, straight into gales that build across 3,000 miles of open Atlantic before they arrive, and for centuries, every ship anchored there in a storm was gambling with its hull and its crew. Naval logs and merchant accounts from the 18th century describe entire convoys scattering in a single night, cables parting and vessels driven onto rocks within sight of a harbour that offered them no real shelter once the wind swung around to the southwest. A fleet that could not find safe water at the mouth of one of Britain's most important naval ports was a problem the Admiralty could not simply live with forever, and every year the petitions grew louder as insurers, merchants, and naval commanders alike counted the cost of another ship lost within sight of harbour. The engineers settled on a wall built entirely inside the water itself, over a mile of stone rising from a seabed 60 feet down, laid one block at a time by men working from open boats in a stretch of ocean that had never held anything solid before. If you like watching how the impossible got built before machines could do it for you, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. Parliament approved the Breakwater in 1806, after decades of petitions from naval officers and merchants who had watched too many ships driven onto the rocks of the Sound in a single bad night. The engineer given the job was John Rennie, already known across Britain for his canals and his bridges, and he spent years studying the tides, the depths, and the storm patterns of the Sound before he committed a design to paper. Work on the seabed began in 1812. The stone came from limestone quarries a few miles inland at Oreston, on the banks of a tidal creek called the Catwater, where local gangs had been cutting building stone for generations before this single project turned their quarries into the engine room of the entire operation. The Quarrymen worked the way stone gangs worked everywhere in that era. 2 men to a drill, one holding the steel bar steady against the rock face, while the other swung a sledgehammer down onto its head, and after every strike, the man holding the drill gave it a quarter turn so the hole stayed round and did not bind the bit. When the hole was deep enough, they packed it with gunpowder, set a fuse, and stepped clear. The blast brought down a face of raw limestone, and the gang went back in to break it into blocks small enough to load and large enough to matter, some of them weighing several tons apiece. There was no ear protection and no dust mask, nothing between a man's lungs and the fine grey powder that hung over every working quarry in Devon by mid-morning. A quarryman did not start on the drill. He usually spent years first as a labourer, breaking and hauling rubble, before anyone trusted him to hold a bar steady, while a partner swung 8 or 10 pounds of iron at his hands, and the masons who dressed the finest facing stones for the upper courses of the Breakwater, ranked above the quarrymen entirely, paid more and treated as skilled tradesmen rather than day labourers, because a poorly squared block could throw off the fit of an entire course above it. Getting the stone from Oreston out to the Sound was its own engineering problem, separate from the Breakwater itself. The quarry sat on a creek that filled and emptied with the tide, so barges could only load and move during certain hours, which meant the entire supply chain of the project ran on a schedule set by the moon rather than the clock. The stone was carried down the Catwater and out into open water on specially built vessels called stone boats, flat, heavy, wide in the beam, fitted with hinged doors built into the bottom of the hull. A boat loaded its stone at the quarry, rode the tide out to the exact position on the chart where the Breakwater needed more weight, and then the crew opened the bottom doors and let the load drop straight down through the hull and into the sea below. No crane touched the stone at the drop point. Gravity did the work, and the boat's position, checked and rechecked against fixed marks on the shore, decided whether that stone landed where the engineers needed it, or several feet off, which on a project measured in tons and years, mattered enormously. The scale of the supply chain is easy to say and hard to picture. Over the full span of construction, engineers eventually recorded more than 3 million tons of stone dropped into the Sound, and at the height of the project, several hundred men were employed across the quarries, the barges, and the breakwater site at once, a workforce large enough to support its own network of blacksmiths, sharpening drill bits, wheelwrights repairing cart axles, and rope makers supplying the miles of cordage the stone boats went through every season. Oreston itself grew around the project, a quarrying hamlet that turned into something closer to an industrial village, with families settling nearby because the work, brutal as it was, paid steadily in a part of England where steady work was not something a labouring family could take for granted. The breakwater grew the way a reef grows, from the bottom up, invisible for most of its working life. Surveyors took soundings with a lead line dropped at fixed intervals along the length of the structure to track how much the seabed had risen since the previous check. A spot that read 50 feet of water one season and 45 feet the next had taken on 5 feet of stone, and that reading was the only proof anyone had that the work was progressing, because nobody on the surface could actually see the mound taking shape below them. It sat under the waves for years, built wider at the base than at the crest, shaped as a long sloped mound rather than a vertical wall, because Rennie understood exactly what a flat face does to an incoming wave. A vertical wall reflects the force of the sea straight back at itself, and the collision between the incoming wave and the reflected one eventually tears the wall apart starting at its base. A sloped mound lets a wave climb it and spend its energy in the climbing, the same way a long hill slows a rolling stone better than a cliff face stops it outright. By the time a wave reached the top of the slope, most of what it carried had already been absorbed by the broken, irregular stone underneath it. The lower courses were rough rubble, simply dumped and left to settle under their own weight for months before anything more was added on top. The upper courses, the part that would eventually break the surface and take the direct hit of every storm coming off the channel, were faced with dressed granite blocks, cut to fit tightly against their neighbours, each one set and adjusted by hand with iron levers, ropes, and the patience of men who understood that a badly seated block would work itself loose within a season and undo months of labour stacked beneath it. Some of those granite-facing stones weighed close to 10 tons, and moving one into its final resting place, underwater, without a diver to guide it precisely, was as much a matter of trained judgment as it was of brute force. Where two facing blocks met above the waterline, masons often cut a matching dovetail-shaped groove into each stone, a joint that would resist being pulled apart sideways even after the lead inside it had long since gone hard, then set an iron cramp across the joint and poured molten lead around it to lock the two blocks together as the metal cooled and hardened. The lead was heated in a portable furnace kept burning on a work platform anchored beside the structure, and pouring it required a steady hand in conditions that were rarely steady, with the platform rising and falling under the men's feet with every swell that passed beneath it. A rushed pour left air pockets that would let seawater in and rust the iron cramp from the inside out within a few winters, quietly weakening a joint that looked solid on the surface. A good pour, done by a mason who understood exactly how the lead would behave as it cooled, could hold two 10-ton blocks together for a century or more. The sound did not cooperate quietly. In November of 1817, a major storm tore through the unfinished breakwater and scattered stone that had taken years to place, forcing the engineers to essentially rebuild entire sections of work they had already considered finished. It was not the only storm to do this over the life of the project, and each one it happened to was a test nobody had asked for, and nobody could refuse. Rennie eventually revised a profile of the structure after these early losses, widening the base and easing the slope further, because the storms had taught him something no drawing table ever could. The sea would find any weakness in a design and return to it again and again until it was corrected. Every revision meant more stone, more barge trips, and more months added to a schedule that had already stretched years past its original estimate, and every extra season meant another round of accounts sent to Parliament explaining why a project everyone still agreed was necessary kept costing more than anyone had first proposed. That kind of setback is worth remembering the next time a project looks hopelessly behind schedule, And if this is the sort of history that holds your attention, there is a lot more of it waiting here, so stay subscribed for what comes after this one. The men doing this work, in the quarries and out on the water, faced risks with none of the formal safety record that modern construction keeps as a matter of course. A missed hammer strike at the drill could shatter the hand of the man holding it steady. A stone, shifting in its sling on a rolling, tide-tossed barge, could crush a man against the hull before anyone nearby had time to shout a warning. Storms could catch a loaded stone boat far from shelter with a full cargo of granite in its hold, and the historical record from quarrying and marine construction projects across Britain in this period consistently describes drownings, crushing injuries, and quarry blasting accidents as an ordinary, expected cost of the work, even in years when no single incident was written down in detail. There was no formal insurance for the labourer the way there was for the cargo he was moving. A man hurt or killed on a stone boat or in a quarry blast was, in most recorded cases, simply replaced by the next man willing to take the wage. Winter work brought its own particular misery. The stone boats did not stop running simply because the weather turned cold, since a project funded season by a parliament that expected visible progress could not afford to sit idle for months at a time. Men worked the open decks of loaded barges through sleet and freezing spray, hauling ropes and levering stone with hands that had gone numb hours earlier, and the same swell that made the lead pour risky made every other task on deck slower and more dangerous besides. Quarry work in winter carried its own version of the same problem, with wet stone dust turning to a slick paste on the cutting faces and frozen ground making footing unreliable exactly where a sledgehammer swing needed it to be solid. The work continued for decades, well beyond what anyone in 1812 had expected to sign up for. Rennie died in 1821, and his son took over direction of the project, seeing through the completion of a structure his father had designed but would never live to see finished. By the 1840s, the breakwater had reached its full length of roughly 1 mile, with short return arms angled inward at each end to help enclose and calm the water on the harbour side. A lighthouse was eventually raised at the western end to warn approaching ships in poor visibility, and a smaller beacon was added at the eastern end soon after. Both of them still stand today on a foundation that began as loose rubble, dropped through the hinged bottom of a wooden barge, more than 2 centuries ago. Decades later, once the breakwater had proven itself against every storm the channel could send, the Navy went further and raised an armoured fort on an artificial island built out from the structure's western end, a granite and iron stronghold that used the breakwater itself as part of its foundation and its defence, proof that the original engineers had built something solid enough to carry weight and purpose nobody in 1812 had planned for. The breakwater changed what Plymouth Sound could actually be used for. Ships that once had no choice but to run for open sea or ride out a gale on exposed moorings could now anchor in genuinely sheltered water, protected by a mile of stone absorbing the worst the channel could throw at it. The Royal Navy used the Sound as a secure fleet anchorage for the remainder of the Age of Sail and on into the steam era that followed, and merchant vessels sheltered there too whenever weather turned against them along that stretch of coast. The weather never changed. What changed was that several thousand men spent decades dropping stone into the right place at the right moment, tide after tide, storm after storm, and turned one of the most dangerous anchorages on the south coast of England into one of the safest. Modern engineers now pour concrete caissons on land and float them into position, use satellite positioning, accurate to a few inches, and run cranes that can lift 100 tons without asking a single man to touch the load. None of that existed in 1812. What existed was a tidal chart, a lead line, a hinged wooden hull, and generations of quarrymen and sailors who understood their trade well enough to build something they could not see, on a foundation they could not inspect, in water that had been sinking ships for as long as anyone in Plymouth could remember. The breakwater is still there today. Boats still pass close along its granite flank on the way in and out of the Sound, and its lighthouse still marks the western end for anyone approaching after dark. It has been doing the job it was built for, without a single repair to the stone core beneath the waterline, for more than 200 years. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of how the impossible got built before modern machines existed to do it, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.